nothing much to offer. There's nothing much to take. I'm an absolute beginner.
You've joined the Betamax Video Club, and we wind you back to our favourite films of the 1980s. My name's Rich Nelson, and tonight I've rented 1986 movie Absolute Beginners. Watching it with me is Tim Worthington from the Looks Unfamiliar podcast TV Cream and his latest book, The Camberwick Green Procrastination Society. Hi Tim, how are you?
I'm fine. Well done for managing to say that correctly as well. So I can't half the time.
I've spent all day talking, so it's nice to practice some tongue twisters. But how are you this evening?
Not bad, thank you. Yeah, been on a bit of an absolute beginner's binge. So yeah.
I mean, this was a film that when I asked if you wanted to do one, this was the first film that you came up with. I'll let you talk about it first. How was it rewatching it for you this time?
Well, it was interesting that I didn't actually see it when it came out. I think it was a 15 certificate, and I was just too young. And the weird thing I always found was, the same with getting videos out, it was easier to get into a film that you weren't supposed to see than one that was just perfectly acceptable but happened to have a higher certificate. And I did try to get into Absolute Beginners at the classic cinema on Allerton Road in Liverpool, and they turned me away. So I didn't see it until, I think it was on Channel 4 in about 1990, 1991. And I wanted to see it all that time because not only am I a massive David Bowie fan and have been literally from longer than I can remember, because I know that when Ashes to Ashes came out, I remember thinking, ooh, it's the new David Bowie song, and I've no recollection of what I liked of his before then, because I must have been about 5 or 6 when that came out, so that's very bizarre. But also, I'm really, really fond, particularly of British films from the 80s, where the ambition exceeded the available resources. And the films themselves are generally panned, but I think they have a lot more to offer, like particularly Morons from Outer Space. I think it's a very unfairly maligned film. Eat the Rich, the second Commentary Presents film. Not a great film, but it's more interesting than people give it credit for. But Absolute Beginners is the absolute king of all of those, because it's a film that has a reputation for being awful. And yet, as Nicholas Pegg pointed out in his book, The Complete David Bowie, Oscars are given to much worse films than it. It is a reasonable film that just fell victim to hype, really. And so watching it again, I still felt that enjoyment of it that I felt when I very first saw it, that it was much better than I expected. And it's got to the stage now, because I've seen it so many times, where, I know what's coming, but I like knowing what's coming. It's, in some ways, I'm not saying it's like a good David Bowie song, but it's like a David Bowie song where, you like it because you know it. And although the shock of the new wears off, the enjoyment of it never wears off.
This, I say, the song, it's one of those that you seem to hear on the radio all the time, and perhaps people a bit younger might not realise that it was actually from a film and it was written for the film. The film itself was based on a book by Colin McInnes and set in 1958, which immediately sort of alters your perceptions a little bit, because you think of Bowie, you think of, certainly don't go back that far. And he's the big star who's linked to the film, but he's not actually in it a huge amount, and you don't really see him until sort of at least halfway through. It opens as this huge, set in Soho, and you have to realise that this it's a musical in a film, but it's slightly different from Grease or anything like that, which seems to be not an inspiration at all. This has the sets, it has the dancing, and as we go through the film, some of the set pieces are really quite spectacular in their way. And while it had quite a large budget for a film at the time, it was about £8 million, which for a British film in the mid-80s was pretty special. It's strange that it's not even moved on in a way that a lot of the cult films have, and trying to track it down on DVD was a bit of a challenge in itself. Even a couple of years ago, it came out as a 30th anniversary edition. It wasn't a massive release, but there's so much value in the film. The soundtrack's pretty special. It's got some big names on there. Just watching it as separately from everything else, it was really a bizarre, but it worked in a very kitsch cult way.
Yeah, I think one of its biggest problems is that Yeah, it gets described as a musical, but as you say, quite rightly, it's not like anything like Grease. The songs are not part of the narrative, really, not part of the story. It's more like something from, I would say, maybe kind of the Gracie Fields sort of approach. And that was a very different kind of film, but where it is literally just, oh, hang on, I'll sing a song now, and then we'll carry on with the film. The songs come into it like that. They don't really move the narrative along, and I think that probably wrong-footed people, and probably still does now, actually. And the other thing which you touched on there is that it's not, although it's based on a novel that is very, very firmly set in late 50s London, a very specific subset of it as well, it isn't a film that tries to recreate that in any real detail. It's big, it's technicolor, it seems to be in several time zones at once, really, because as well as the bits that do accurately recreate the 50s, or at least pastiche them, you've got the Style Council doing a modern sounding song on the soundtrack. You've got Smiley Culture doing a nice bit of South London toasting, as if it was a brand new club scene. And that, I think, goes back to Julian Temple obviously came out of the punk scene, and there was a whole mishmash there between the 70s and the 50s. There was a lot of kind of appropriation of retro fashion, the teddy boy look, along with the punk look. And I think that's what he was aiming for. And again, I think people come into it expecting something that looks exactly like their image of the UK in the 50s. Well, for a start, it's not in black and white, which makes a difference. But I think people get thrown by that as well. I think it's not the film that people are expecting, and it obviously wasn't when it came out either.
No, because the main difference where the film opens and it's all about our hero who, because the chap wasn't named in the book, has taken the name of the author. So it's one of the rare films where the hero, if you want, is called Colin. And he is in love with a girl, Crepe Suzette, which is a very nice sounding pancake, 18-year-old Patsy Kensit, which was a very interesting sort of dynamic between the two, because the story is that she becomes sort of quite famous, or certainly quite successful in her field, by essentially gate crashing her boss's fashion show. And the actor who played Colin, who wasn't a star, you don't really have headlining actor in a film, any film these days, who doesn't have his own Wikipedia page.
I was just going to say that, yeah.
And having to do some research, he was the very standard villain from the bill here, and a successful career as in smaller parts. You know, the opening scene in Soho and following his adventures as a photographer through late 50s Soho, and we meet the cast, and we meet, which for me is a very strange, Lionel Blair, and that whole part which he comes into later on as he's a camp music mogul in Soho, and it's Lionel Blair, of course he's camp, but it's just so surreal seeing him in this film, when maybe at my age, I remember him from Give Us a Clue and things like that. And the whole scene, it's like something out of the set of a West Side Story, or, very old school Hollywood type musical where everyone, it seems to dance in synchronicity and everything like that. And very much like a touring theatre company, which, whether that's a compliment or not, I'm not quite sure. But it's such a strange film. It's hard to really put it into words.
Well, really, the whole film should be celebrated, if just for that opening scene alone, because it really is amazing. They claim it was all done in one shot, one take, and it does look like it as well. It's just a camera panning and sweeping through several... It's obviously a studio set, it's not real streets, but that makes it all the more visually interesting. Just goes through, there's all aspects of London life, real and imagined, all intermingling with each other, crossing each other's paths, literally in a lot of cases, with Colin, in inverted commas, at the centre of it all. And the interesting thing was that I had another watch of Jazzin' for Blue Jean, which is a film Julian Temple did with David Bowie. I think it was 2 years before Absolute Beginners. It was to promote his album Tonight, which, if you ask me, needed all the promoting it could get. It's not one of my favourites. I don't think it's many people's. But that is a really funny film, where it's an odd construct, because he plays David Bowie, the real person, this sort of down-to-earth, chummy geezer, who, trying to impress a girl, takes her on a date to see, well, he's called Screaming Lord Byron, but he's really David Bowie, the myth, the construct, who's a very pretentious, overdressed, drug-addled pop star, with over-the-top lyrics, prone to headaches and so on, and they run up against each other in a fight over the girl, really, and the real Bowie says the imagined Bowie, all kinds of criticisms, like jokes about his recent tours and your record sleeves are better than the songs and that sort of thing. It's a really, really funny short film, but the interesting thing is there's a scene in there which is almost like a kind of doodle in the margin idea for that opening of Absolute Beginners, where Bowie's walking down a real street in this instance, where there's all kinds of people crisscrossing around him, going about their sort of nighttime business, lots of musicians flit in and out, sonically as well as visually, and he's just keeping up his monologue throughout. And it's almost like, I don't think it was a conscious setup for that opening scene of Absolute Beginners, but it's very definitely, I think it's the germ of the idea. I think that's where it came from. But the realisation of Absolute Beginners itself is that should be in people's favourite film scenes of all time, and it never gets talked about anywhere.
No, it's a shame almost. It seems to get lost as it's a set piece that works so well. It's really well created, but the problem, it seems to be so out of sync with the rest of the film, where while the style's the same, it's very zing. There's almost, you're expecting some jazz hands. Ultimately, this is a cross between a story about a love-torn couple who want to better themselves and get up in the social society, but also set against, which we'll come on to, the backdrop of gentrification and the Notting Hill race riots of West 11 and White City, where there's real sort of tension in there that you don't explore in the first scene, because you think it's a very nice, happy sort of exploration of Soho and the seedy side of it, and some of the bits that even now you'd see around Soho with some of the strip clubs and the sex clubs and the almost next door to the nightclubs. And there's some little sort of clues in there when they talk about Cool and refer to him as a coloured cat, which even by today's standards isn't perhaps what you'd expect to hear in a film.
No.
You get some of the names in this film, and in the next scene where Suzette is working backstage at a fashion show where James Fox is the head of this fashion brand, and it's all very staid, and it's Henleys of Mayfair. And she has a bit of a moment where she comes out on the stage and goes a little bit wild. It's like a scene out of the Jim Carrey Mask film. She starts throwing paint around and the crowd go wild for her, and she starts gyrating with the extras of the group. And it's so strange. It works in the way that it moves from one song to another, and it advances her character in the way that she has gone from a wannabe to the star of this fashion show, which it doesn't quite convey that it's going to be front page of the news or anything else, but she's this breakout star, and James Fox eventually within that scene seems to identify it and pins all his hopes on her for the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's full of moments like that. I mean, the one that really stands out to me, although it's a great scene, is Ray Davies's song, which is kind of set in almost a huge, like, a house split in half, so you can see in all the rooms, and you'd see all of Colin's family up to no good in various rooms while the dad's just reading the paper and not caring, and that's Ray Davies, obviously. I mean, on the documentary, on the DVD and Blu-ray, they say that was filmed first separately, so they had something to show the American backers, but it really doesn't. There's not really an attempt to make it fit into the film properly. It's kind of always reminded me of, on those low-rent ITV sketch shows in the 70s and 80s, not naming any names, Jim Davison, where there'd be an unfunny song with those kind of visuals would just suddenly be in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And normally with no audience laughter over it. And it's that jarring, really.
It's strange because the way the you can almost see how it was visualized, and there's all these different adventures going on, and Colin's half brother's off doing something that looks a little bit seedy. His mum is cavorting with the lodger. His dad's just trying to get on with his life. And for a Ray Davies song, famous in his own right, it does seem so out of kilter with the rest of the film. And it's sort of going back to where the director has clearly come from a background of musical video.
Yeah.
And it looks almost like a compilation album of music videos that's kind of cobbled together.
Well, that's just it, really. I mean, the whole thing that I feel about Absolute Beginners now is everyone sort of behind the scenes, really. It was a large group of very promising people who sort of bit off more than they could chew, because I have read in the past that there have been previous attempts to make films of Absolute Beginners where people have thought, no, that's unfilmable, and abandoned it. And yet they had to go. And, you've got... I'm sure we'll come back to the 3 film companies involved weren't exactly geared towards making this kind of film. But yeah, Julian Temple had been making pop videos for a number of years for people like ABC, The Kinks. He did The Kinks Come Dancing, of course, which I think is where the whole Ray Davies thing came in. Culture Club, Depeche Mode. He did Come On Eileen for Dexys Midnight Runners. The Sade videos as well, which people forget because... she's seen as the epitome of bland now, how good those first couple of videos are. But they're all like self-contained stories. They're almost like short films in themselves, like the videos he did for Bowie were as well. And yes, it does have that feel of just a load of them strung together, really, with a couple of linking narrative bits, which isn't very fair because there's a lot more to it than that, but you could easily label it as such.
Yeah, and even in the context of the setting of the house, it's in supposedly rundown Pimlico, which says a lot about how times have changed. And we talk about the beginning of where the race riots happened and some of where the origin story is. You see an early Ed Tudor Pole appearance as Ed the Ted, like a cartoonish zombie teddy boy who seems intent on really antagonizing and getting in the face. And it's a very odd character. Again, I imagine that he was one of the characters in the book who probably stood out in a smallish role, but they've had to turn him into a cartoon, sort of very elaborate character in order to make him work within the film context. And it's a bit like a cross between the Addams Family and something else, where him and his little crew hang around outside the advertising hoarding singing their song or their little set piece. But after that, we've got Crep or Suzette. I'll never forget the name seems to keep interchanging. She's done quite well for herself, and she is now engaged to James Fox. Colin, on the other hand, has started to make some circles after getting a little part-time job with Lionel Blair, and he's now sort of photographing in social circles. So, of course, we're still only sort of a third of the way into the film, where, of course, they are going to meet at some party, and they do. It's Dido's party, isn't it? Where they have the spinning dance floor, and she's very coy about the ludicrously oversized diamond ring. He gets jealous and gets punched in the face for his troubles, and that's where we meet Mr. Ziggy Stardust for the first time.
Yes, yeah. I think he steals the whole film, really. And the weird thing is that was the big thing at the time. Apparently the financial backers weren't happy about him being in it. And also, it's what most critics seemed to lay into at the time. Bowie in the 80s, although he was commercially very big, his artistic stock was quite low. And I think it was seen as a bit of a, write the theme tune, sing the theme tune thing. But he really steals the whole film. I mean, I can't claim credit for this. It was someone I know, Stephen O'Brien, the writer, said this when writing a tribute to David Bowie a couple of years ago, was that you have to say it is quite a person who can be dancing on a giant typewriter and still seem larger than life. He really just fills up the whole screen. He takes over the film, essentially. And I think most people, if they watch it now, it will be because of his involvement, really.
Yeah, and sort of since his passing, and a lot of his back catalogue gets explored, and he's more famous, certainly in films, for certainly Labyrinth as the big one. And when I hinted on Twitter that we'd be doing a Bowie film, everyone assumed it would be Labyrinth. Yet this one, he is a caricature of himself. He's got a very strange accent, which I can't quite pin. It's a cross between his own and a slight Americanism, and a very almost like he's trying to portray himself as a yuppie, again, another music mogul. And it's just, little things like tomorrow's watch today and this, that, and the other. His hair seems to have a life of its own in a very sort of 80s way. It doesn't seem to fit in the 50s era. And you touched on it then, the essentially music video for That's Motivation is just so bizarre. It is an 80s music video. It looks a bit like Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer. It's just so weird. It is a music video dropped into the middle of this, I'll call it a film, but other music videos as well. And it really takes you a second to adjust to the fact that it's David Bowie in this film. One minute he is prancing around with this huge typewriter. The next minute he's on a model plane around the planet. Then he's climbing an advert Mount Everest. I mean, what's all that?
The main problem with that, though, is that That's Motivation is a bit of a duff song, really. It's not. It doesn't, unlike Absolute Beginners itself, it doesn't really go anywhere. And they put all that effort in, and the song isn't really that memorable. I mean, I can't tell you how it goes now. And, I'm a big defender of a lot of 80s Bowie. You wonder why they gave that such prominence, really. Because it just doesn't seem worth the effort. As you say, the visuals are absolutely astonishing. And it's a fairly tepid song behind it.
I mean, I understand that this was one of his sort of conditions for doing the music for the film, and that he said, I'll do the music for the film if you give me the casting role as he got. He didn't want the Colin role. He took that particular role. And if you're a filmmaker of any sort and you're looking to make a film big, even 80s Bowie wasn't quite the name he was at the time, you just let him do what you want. You kind of just have to let him loose and say, oh, go on, it's you. We can't say anything. What you're going to say, that song's rubbish. No, you're okay, carry on. And I do wonder if there was that element of that in there where no one wanted to say no to him because he's the star.
Well, that's absolutely true of David Bowie around that point. I mean, he says he used to say himself that was pretty much why he did Tin Machine at the end of the 80s, was that he was a bit sick of being surrounded by yes men and the results not being good. And actually, Julian Temple did the Tin Machine launch promo, which was shown in cinemas, where it's just 30 minutes of basically very brief, essentially pop videos of nearly every song on the album, but obviously a lot of it shot on CCTV, that sort of thing. But yeah, that's why that came about. And obviously, Absolute Beginners was an experience where nobody said to him, maybe you want to maybe swap the songs around, maybe we'll do Absolute Beginners the song in that sequence.
Rather than use it.
Which, of course, the video for that is a much better fit, really. It's in the style of the film, but it's not actually part of the film. It's based on the old advert for Strand cigarettes where, sort of bloke in a hat and a Mac, you're never alone with the Strand walking through empty streets. It's kind of a remake of that, but you keep seeing it's in black and white. You keep seeing bits of the film in colour sort of reflected in puddles and mirrors and so on. And at one point, and I didn't notice this for years, he sets light to and then stamps on a copy of The Sun with a fairly racist story on the front page, which, again, is continuing the themes of the film, really. But I mentioned that I put it on Twitter the other day. A lot of people saying, yeah, I'd never noticed that. And yet there it is. So much for him being this fascist that people seem to be determined to prove he was, but...
It's very much like the modern day, unfortunately. And something I skipped over deliberately there was we start getting the introduction to the building of the White City flats, where they're talking about knocking down the old derelict houses and rebuilding essentially ugly tower blocks, which Bowie's character admits himself that he's got an involvement in, but they're horrible, horrible buildings. And the so-called White Defence League, which sounds scarily familiar, start making an appearance in that area where they're turning up at the weddings of black couples and generally not at this point up to a lot of bad things other than being generally rude and unpleasant. We'll come on to that a little bit later on. But one of the things we do see is the character Flicker, who some of our people may know is the baddie from Wesley Snipes' vehicle, Passenger 57, which was a little bit strange. Obviously, this was filmed 7 or 8 years before that, and he's very much the ringleader of this racist group of thugs who are hired by the building people to virtually drive to create the animosity in the area, to make the appetite for the flats and make it easier for them to get, well, I wouldn't say planning permission, but certainly make the area a lot more tense. And some of the behaviour that they'll demonstrate, both once Flicker's introduced and later on, it's really, for supposedly a fairly light-hearted musical, it really changes tone really quite quickly.
Yeah, well, I went and dug out the BBFC report from 1986 when they were trying to decide what certificate to give it. And they do actually say that there was a lot of quite near-the-knuckle stuff, the violence, but also the sexual and drug references as well, which are sort of softened by, as you say, the musical setting. And they deliberated for some time over whether it should be a PG or a 15, because there wasn't a 12 at that point. And eventually they erred on the side of caution and went for a 15. It's worth bearing in mind that, this was just after the whole video nasties thing, and all eyes were on them, because it had been for a couple of years. What are you going to do about this? So I'm not surprised that they bumped it up, but I think it's now a 12, isn't it? Or is it even a PG?
I think it's, I'm not sure, but it's certainly not a 15 now. And by current standards, it really wouldn't be.
It's a very strange time, the mid-80s, for film classification and censorship. I mean, we could do a whole other podcast about that, I'm sure. But I don't quite see from this perspective. I look at it now and think, why was it a 15? But I'm sure at the time I would have been quite shocked by some of the violence in it. Even though I had seen things like, I'd probably seen The Evil Dead by then. But there's a difference between, exaggerated fantasy violence and some Teds with bike chains, It's like a very, very unpleasant Grange Hill, some bits of it.
The weird thing is that this film was released in 1986. It's only throughout the country, throughout UK, in the early 80s, there had been a number of issues with racially aggravated rioting. It was only a year after Broadwater Farm, and been issues in Brixton and further around the country as well. And where these sort of tensions, and the police perhaps more heavily involved in the real life ones, but some of these really did sort of touch a nerve. We've got people like Tony Hippolyte, who he was cool, and he was cool. He was also the character cool. He had a large role to play, and the final scene, we have jumped ahead a little bit. Some of the violence that's threatened and some of the language that's used, it's so, again, perhaps of the time, and they're trying to tell a story of riots in a racial hotbed of Notting Hill, and I suppose that's how Notting Hill Carnival was born out of that. But it's really a huge departure from the opening sort of scene, the opening act, where, like you say, there's people with bike chains and knives and all sorts of improvised weapons. There's the bus on fire, like the Tottenham riots of a couple of years ago. And yet those that aren't immediately involved in the fighting are doing some very jazzy numbers. They're in perfect sync. I can't name any dance moves, but they're looking very like they've come out of drama school, doing all these jumps and poses, and it's so strange. You expect to see a film like this, and there isn't that, even within the scene, the change of tone, but some of it's almost like a very Camp Blazing Saddles style complete change in the background where you see these guys dancing. It's so odd.
Well, that's the thing. Maybe it would have worked a bit better had those two strands, light and the dark, been sort of interwoven a bit more. So it's more of a consistent whole, because it does seem to take a very dark turn about 2/3 the way through. And it isn't just building up to that. It seems to just suddenly do that. And it doesn't really, unless you count the very, very end scene, doesn't really pull back from that. And sometimes, it's not a film I would sit down on a nice afternoon and just watch for fun the way I would The Wrong Box or something, because I know that unpleasant third of it is coming up,
Yeah, and even the singing of "If You Go Down to the Woods Today," it's like something out of Candyman or something. It's just really dark and menacing. It's so odd. And even intertwined with that, you've got the part where Suzette and Henley are just happen to be travelling through in the Rolls Royce, and they're attacked by the locals, and it's like that photo of Charles and Camilla when their car was set upon.
Yes, yeah,
They look terrified within this hugely expensive car, and then she doesn't take a lot to turn either. She gets dragged out of the car, and suddenly maybe it's the mob mentality or something where she decides, I'll get involved in that as well. I'll have some.
Well, it is true that by and large, Julian Temple's pop videos from around then are not, jolly sing-along affairs. There's a dark edge to a lot of them. I mean, I mentioned Smooth Operator by Sade. It's quite a dark storyline. There's just after he did Day In, Day Out for Bowie, which is about a prostitute in sort of Latin neighborhood in America who gets attacked and assaulted while Bowie's roller skating around as sort of an ineffective guardian angel playing the bass, singing it. They're often quite dark tinged, and I don't think, maybe he didn't really know how to make a jaunty film, because his only real full length ones before that, apart from Jazzing for Blue Jean, which kind of sort of invalidates my argument a bit, because that's an outright comedy film, although obviously that was clearly Bowie taking the lead on that, was The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which is many things, but it's not entertaining family fare, and Man Trap for ABC, which is essentially a new romantic band in a film noir with some of their songs in the middle of it. So they're none of those are exactly congruent with the tone of the opening and sort of the Lionel Blair sequence and so on. Really, it's quite a contrast.
I'd say the current media issues at the moment with harassment by powerful people at the moment is Hollywood anyway, and Lionel Blair, he does come across almost like a semi-predatory sort of character, where he's enjoying that power he has over, in this case, young boys who he's trying to make a few quid out of. But again, there's something where it was played for laughs a little bit, and I think at the time perhaps people didn't have such a cynical view of things, but maybe things in the last few years can make us look back at that and go, right, okay, we know how things may have been in certain circles, and maybe he was playing on that a little bit and some of the things that he knew. But you've talked about Sade there, and that she has a role in the film as well, and she plays a gig where Colin turns up. He's starting to struggle with his role in life and his, sudden advance to fame, but he's got quite well, and he turns up having made an earlier point about not drinking. He's clearly very in an advanced state of relaxation anyway. And he turns up at her gig and seems to partially have lust for her, and then decides to go and steal a scooter and go for a little joyride.
I wonder what film inspired that as well. It's basically a scene from Quadrophenia, that. Yeah. At this point, we've also come back to meet
wizard, who early in the film came across as a very sort of a little scoundrel, a little, nothing menacing. He was just a little toe rag who'd go around sort of pickpocketing. And at this point, he's starting to turn. He comes up later in the film as well as a very aggravating figure within these race riots. And maybe that's a deliberate exposure where they've seen his character progress behind the scenes from a little scamp, something almost a Del Boy-esque character, and turned into a really unpleasant, horrible person. The really strange part that obviously we see Wizard at the rally, where when I saw the credits for this and Stephen Burkoff's name popped up. Now, maybe it's just my limited exposure to him, but most things I've seen him in, he's a Nazi. It's
yes,
the Raiders of the Lost Ark and Octopussy. He was not a Nazi, but he was certainly a Cold War loving megalomaniac. And I did wonder. I thought, have I missed him? Was it a small cameo? Oh no, he's full on. He's Nazi. He's playing. I don't want to say he's typecast. I'm sure he's a really good actor, but he's just basically dressed up as Hitler, giving this rally to the local white youths, and Colin sort of stumbles into this parade where he sees Wizard, and it's really, really horrible. Again, like continue on that dark tone where I do wonder if, I suppose things like that were happening, maybe not too mainstream, but this is pretty full on, and to get someone who does have a big acting pedigree to come and basically do what he does in other films just to wind people up, it's very, very strange.
Well, yeah, I think we were a couple of years away from the big resurgence in far-right politics, which, in the late 70s, it seems to have been a particularly prevalent thing. And punk had very big reactions against that. And there was all things like the Not the 9 O'Clock News Baronet Oswald Ernald Mosley song, where, they were just repulsed by how pleasant the papers were in their obituaries for Oswald Mosley, and decided to sing a song saying, yeah, no, he was a nasty piece of work, really. So, obviously, that was still... I wouldn't say it was abating by the mid-80s, but it was kind of... Julian Temple was clearly working on some aggravations that he'd had for a couple of years that maybe weren't as... Although there were riots going on, he seemed to be tackling a different aspect to it, to maybe what was actually the driving force at that point, because it was more institutional, the root of the problem in the mid-80s, I would say. It is interesting that it's still sort of going on around then, that it's still something he felt he had to address that directly, because I would say, although in some ways the film really tones down some elements of the book, particularly parts of Suzette's character, I think it actually takes all of that much further than the book actually did. It pushes it on a much bigger scale, a much more frightening scale as well.
So in the book, I've never read it. Is it... it's difficult. Like you say, some people may have read it and thought it was unfilmable. Would you say the book was more balanced?
I would say the book was actually more in inverted commas Colin's head than the film is. By which I don't mean it's his imagination. I mean, everything is from his point of view. I think the film's slightly removed from that. I think it opens it out a little more. You get more sense of other people's character as opposed to his interpretation of their character, really. Okay.
Well, I say it's certainly made me actually want to go and read it, which I suppose is always the point of some of these films, is that they make you want to go and explore. Maybe a lot of the time it's a film that you think, oh, it's so brilliant, I want to see what the actor's other work was. But in this, you want to see what the hell was actually going on, and at what point did the film move so far away from the book, and moving very much towards the end, where we've had the really vicious sort of Colin v. Flicker fight, and Cool getting involved, and the firebombing of the house, where again that it's taking it beyond that sort of camp set element, where setting fire to where the meetings are happening and everything else. It's just so strange when all of a sudden we end on Smiley Culture, who again, an icon of that sort of music scene. But it's just so strange that again we finished this film in that sort of scene and then end on Smiley Culture basically starting a gig when it's it's so strange, and you sort of feel like you don't want to apportion blame, and part of the appeal of rewatching these old films and doing a podcast about it is that we're trying to appreciate the film, and you just wonder perhaps if it was edited differently or something, it would have, one, the tone wouldn't have been so jarring, but two, it would have really given a bit more credence to the end, where we're joined by the benefit of history here. We know what's happened with White City. It's basically now a giant shopping centre. What happened after that? Did Suzette and Colin end up together? We'll have to assume so. Did they went back to his grubby little bedsit with the albums in the fridge and everything else, and the scene of his, again, vicious fight with Ted?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting that it ends with, it's not just Smiley Culture, but Smiley Culture doing a toasted version of So What by Miles Davis, which is really the thing about the two eras tied together. It's almost like they're saying, look, this is all 50s stuff, but look, you're in the present as well. Here's the man who did Police Officer and Cockney Translation, to, in case you were getting frightened by the past. And it is that mishmash thing, and I think it's caused by a number of things. I mean, there's a very telling bit on, again, the documentary on the Blu-ray, where Ed Tudor Pole talks about how the American backers started interfering and how angry it made him. And he makes reference to a scene where a set painter had done this amazing set, and then one of the executives came over and said, I won't do a tacky American accent, but you need a flash of red across there. People like red. And he was sitting there fuming, thinking, how dare you come and tell this poor guy that's worked really hard for 2 hours, just put this stupid thing in for no reason. So there was that interference. But also, I think none of the three film companies involved in it, because, there were actually three, were really geared up for this kind of film. The main people were Palace Productions, they'd been quite successful with The Company of Wolves and Mona Lisa, but they'd also shown a lot of signs of not knowing what they were doing in some ways. They were the ones that got, of all the people involved in the Video Nasties scandal, they got taken to court because they resisted the charge that The Evil Dead was obscene. But they just bought it sight unseen from Sam Raimi, basically. And although it had the cinema certificate, they hadn't looked into the legality of putting it out on video. And, there was that whole interesting court case about that, which must have been while Absolute Beginners were being filmed. So maybe they had their eye off the ball because of that as well. There's also Goldcrest Films, who were very successful, but they've been successful with things like Chariots of Fire, Gandhi, Local Hero, Robin of Sherwood on the TV. None of these are really all singing or dancing period pieces with pop stars in them. They're very serious and atmospheric and, location rich works. Whereas this is mostly in a studio with, leftover punks like leaping about all over the place. And of course, Patsy Kensit, who we haven't really mentioned this far, but it's quite interesting that, obviously she'd been a child actor. She's in things like, the main thing I remember her from as a child was a thing called Quincy's Quest, which is a Tommy Steele panto on ITV, and I think it was in 1979. At that point, she'd obviously started to resent all of that because she was in a band called Eighth Wonder, where people probably think now of basically what was a Pet Shop Boys record with her singing over it, which was credited to Eighth Wonder, which wasn't really. They were a proper band. And they were proper sort of like neo-psychedelic band who played the same circuit as people like Boys Wonder and Doctor and the Medics. And I think that's why she was chosen for this, above all else, was because, she was going out on stage in Dusty Springfield kind of eyeshadow and retro dresses, singing retro-styled songs. She doesn't really fit with the Goldcrest profile. And there's also Virgin Films, who, let's be honest about this, they've mainly been there to do films, promote their bands like XTC and so on, until they did, in 1984, they did 1984 and Electric Dreams. Now, I'm quite fond of Electric Dreams, but neither of those really be said to constitute a good track record in filmmaking decisions. So you've got three people who really, three backers rather, who really weren't suited to this kind of film at all. And obviously, I think they were all pulling in different directions, possibly.
Yeah, and I think it shows in that you've got so many competing, demands, but you've also got the film heading in different directions where it seems almost in the way that... Do you ever see the episode of The Simpsons where Homer got to design the car? And it was...
Yes.
And it was a bit like that, where it's like, right, what do you want most in a car? Well, we'll have that. And what do you want most? And the finished product is so unbelievably bad that because... And I'm not saying this is unbelievably bad, because there are some very good parts of it, and there's so many parts of it that perhaps with a little bit of tinkering and maybe produced slightly or presented slightly differently would work a lot better. And it's like it's done by committee where no one's taken the lead necessarily, and so many styles have been allowed to drift together without any real knitting, and it's so strange. And even that scene where Patsy Kensit's singing Having It All, and it's the worst coffee shop of all time. It makes Starbucks look like a brilliant place to go. It's frothy coffee, and the beatniks doing the poetry, and it's just so really, again, like crazy. But again, a music video for Patsy Kensit and her band just dropped into this part where, again, I suppose in a more regular run-of-the-mill film, it would just be a scene where she's saying she doesn't want to go for dinner, but they've really ramped it up and made it this musical number. And it's just so strange. It's watching it, in preparation for doing this, and I watched it on 2 days ago. I was trying to explain it to my wife, who was at work in the evening, and I said, I don't know what I make of the film. I'd seen it a long time ago, and I don't think I sat the whole way through and watched it. And actually sitting there watching it with I won't give myself too much credit, semi-critical eye, just trying to put it all together, and it's just really crazy. And part of me really wants to make other people watch it just to see what we're talking about. It's hard to sell a film like this. It's hard to talk about it. Within our conversation tonight, we've dotted from beginning to end to middle, and we can't seem to keep in sequence, and it seems to be very much in keeping with the rest of the film.
Well, I think that's really what did for it at the time, was there was so much hype about it, and it isn't a film that justifies hype at all. I mean, it really did get out of control, because there were things like, it looks like Bowie went a bit off script with his talking up of it. Paul Weller did a bit as well. There were all kinds of excited articles in the NME and so on. And at that point, I think, when you look back, people were probably sick of hype, because let's not forget that it came out around the same time Zieg Zieg Sputnik appeared, who, their music, although I like their lone album, the music doesn't really match up to the hype that they got originally. As Today, the newspaper was launched at the same time, which, a lot of excitement over it because it had the colour front cover, but it was just a newspaper at the end of the day. It didn't change the world. It didn't last very long. And I think people were probably starting to resent things like that. And so when Absolute Beginners, very absolutely, as much as I love it, it does not, warrant that level of hype at all.
No.
I think people were only too happy to kick it, and in some ways I can't blame them, really. It's kind of the same as, I've always had to think about, that we've got this, box set TV culture now, where there are one or two really good shows, like Breaking Bad, for example, that live up to the claims that people made for them. But I feel that there were a lot of programs that had almost come and gone before people discovered them over here, like The Wire, like House, which are all really good, but people missed the chance to tell all their mates about them. And for a while it became, any new program that came on from America, people would be saying to you, oh, I've seen that, oh, it's really, really good. And then you watched it and you thought, it's not actually that good. Why are they saying it is? And I think Absolute Beginners kind of fell into that camp as well. People were telling you before you'd seen it that it was going to blow your mind, and it doesn't blow your mind. I'll be honest about that.
It makes you think, though. It certainly works your mind.
Yeah.
One thing I do like to ask the guests on the podcast is, if this film was made today, and I don't think of a remake, but if this book had been knocking around in the film studios, and we'll add another 30 years on, so we're 2017 and we're looking back 60 years to the 50s. Who or what do you reckon would be different about it if it were made now? And would there be anyone, I mean, it's again very devil's advocate sort of question, but who do you think would be the Bowie sort of the star name attached to it? And would there be any sort of, I say would there be any point, but would there be any credence in, if it were made today, adding that star person, or do you think it would benefit more from being a much more low-key production?
I think if anyone was to do it now, they would probably make it more realistic, more, less colourful, more gritty and grimy, less in the fantasy world, really. I don't think there would really be much room within that for stunt casting, but who you would have instead of Bowie is quite interesting, because I would prefer to see it these days be somebody female. I mean, the obvious thing to say is, I'm not quite down with the young person's pop scene these days. The obvious one to say would obviously be Lady Gaga, but that's a bit of an obvious choice, really. But that sort of thing, I would rather, if they put that element into it, I'd rather, it wasn't just a bloke again, because you'd end up with somebody like Ed Sheeran.
Oh, God. This is the thing, and unfortunately, in a couple of the podcasts we've done now already, that the name Russell Brand seems to pop up, and it's just a horrendous thing where I wouldn't be surprised if his name would be attached to it in some way. But like you say, it's you do wonder with the way that film studios are going now, and where there's very much that the middle ground doesn't appear to be there anymore. You've either got the absolute blockbusters and then the very, very small independent pieces, which they kind of pay for. And perhaps a film like this, where in 1986 terms, a fair bit of money went into it, and it certainly didn't make very much back, where money's gone into it, there's some big names attached, and yet it's so disjointed. You'd almost hope that perhaps the purse holders would be a little bit more restrained and demand a little bit more value for money. I mean, in closing, would you recommend this film to, say, if you just met someone or they asked for your opinion on a film to watch, would this be one that you'd recommend?
I've got a bad track record in recommending films of people that I've just met, because I have some very odd taste in films. I have urged more than one person to watch Morons from Outer Space, linking back to the start, and that's never gone down well. But I would say I recently persuaded a friend of mine who's I would say he's an even bigger Bowie train spotter than me, who he'd never actually seen it just because of the reputation of it. Persuaded him to watch it when the Blu-ray came out. And he actually, he quite enjoyed it. He said, it wasn't a masterpiece, but it's better than he was expecting. So for that reason, I would recommend it to people, because it's a more interesting film than you probably think. I
think, as you say, it's very interesting. And while you wouldn't say it's one of the classic films, and it certainly wasn't one with the scenes that you recommend, and it doesn't get shown on telly very often, but it's certainly one that you'd suggest to people that have a watch of this and just see, am I crazy? Is this really what it is? It's I wouldn't, and I'm part of this, as I want to take the films to the charity shop after I finish, because but I really want to keep this and almost watch it again at some point, just to say, like, with the benefit of hindsight, and my wife would like to watch it at some point as well, and I'd quite fancy sitting down and watching it again and just seeing her reactions to it, but also just watching it. It's such an odd film, and I can't hate it, because it's managed to make me think about it a lot, and it's made me think about all these different things, but it's so strange, and not in that bizarre way, but it's just, you do wonder, what were they thinking, in a good way, I think. Ultimately, recommend it to someone as an interest piece rather than something that one for the bucket list.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to become anyone's favourite film.
No.
I'll be straightforward about that. But there were a lot of worse films in the 80s. Well, Electric Dreams, for a start, which there has been an attempt recently to reappraise that. And, just see it as a good, bad film. Yeah. That's my summation there. But, there are boring films. There are reprehensible films. There are films I've no interest in, worthy films, unfunny comedies. There's the Gladiatress, the Smack the Pony film, which is possibly the worst film I've ever seen. To kick something like Absolute Beginners is a waste of time, really, because it is worth much more than that.
I think it's certainly one for film students to have a look at and just sort of see this is an alternative view of things and a film adaptation from a book that misfired, but it certainly isn't without merit. And I don't think anyone could watch this and say they hate it. That'd be far too much.
Yeah.
Right, well, I'm going to pause the video then, and I'll have to rewind it before I take it back to the video shop. Tim, if anyone is interested in hearing some of your other musings, where's the best place for them to find you?
timworthington.org.
And that's some links on there to your podcast. And so how many books is it you've got now? Is it 6?
There's 3 sort of proper ones and 3 sort of anthologies because I write stuff all over the place for all kinds of places. And there's 3 of those, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Betamax Video Club. And what I'm going to do...
Thank you for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. And as I say, a good excuse to watch this film, which is the main reason I'm doing these podcasts. And what I'll do is I'll play you out the number 1 song at the time, which was Living Doll. So forgive me for that, for putting that in your ears. And I'll see you next time at the Betamax Video Club.
Get down! Okay. Hey, Cliff! I've just invented a great new sound! Got to do my best to please her. Ow! Untie your legs, Vivian. Settle down, chaps.